Father in heaven, as we continue studying your plan of true education, pray that you'll give us wisdom. And I know that many of these things are challenging to our traditional understanding, and just pray that you'll help us to have a clear insight into what your plan is. Help me as I speak, Lord. May I explain clearly. May these words come from you. And I ask in Jesus' name, amen. All right, how to put your child on God's schedule. Some of this material is going to be familiar to some of you, although I have added a little bit to it from the normal talks that I do. But I again want to stress that this DVD series is going to be your base, comprehensive look at these topics. There's no way I can cover all of it here at this seminar, and especially not in the next hour here. There are almost 3 hours of just what I'm going to be talking about now on this DVD series. So it's much more in-depth on this series. So I want to really encourage you to avail yourself of that. And I believe we also have some USBs with us. Some of you I know are saying, I don't even have a DVD player. But we have physical USBs, I believe, if we remembered to bring those. How to put your child on God's schedule. I read this earlier, and I want to study this out a little more and look at some of the science behind why. We're told that parents should be the only teachers of their children until they have reached 8 or 10 years of age. As fast as their minds can comprehend it, the parents should open before them God's great book of nature. The only schoolroom for children from 8 to 10 years of age should be in the open air, amid the opening flowers and nature's beautiful scenery, and their only textbook should be the treasures of nature. These lessons, imprinted upon the minds of young children amid the pleasant, attractive scenes of nature, will not soon be forgotten. So to break that down, what we're reading is a curriculum for children up until the age of 8 or 10. And who should the teachers be? The parents, especially the mother. The textbook was nature, and the schoolroom was the open air, outdoors. Notice how simple this is. Don't need to worry about which curriculum to get, which textbooks to buy, how to teach, and all that stuff. It's very simply laid out here. Now, we often focus here on what not to do. We spend a lot of time. We're going to talk some about that, how we shouldn't have an academic setting at too young of an age. That's important. But there's actually a more important emphasis that we find here, and that is not on what not to do as much as it is on what to do. In other words, there's a window of time here that parents have been given to focus on character development. And if we're focused on the books at this early age, we're going to miss out on this window of time when we need to be focused on character development. But let's spend a little bit of time talking about the science as to why the formal academic setting is not good for children under the age of 8 or 10. Modern kindergarten has changed a lot. It is not what it used to be. 90% of students are being taught to read in kindergarten. 97% in classes where composing and writing full sentences is necessary. 99% are learning capitalization and punctuation in kindergarten. Time for hands-on activities has been significantly reduced. So the world is certainly not following God's counsel. No surprise. An increasing societal focus on academic readiness has led to a focus on structured activities that are designed to promote academic results as early as preschool, with a corresponding decrease in playful learning. Now, the world has a lot of emphasis on playful learning, play is important. God's perfect method, though, is simply spending time with the parents through the activities of everyday life, not only in play. But nonetheless, even the world is recognizing, even the science, I should say, of the world is recognizing the problem here. 30% of U.S. kindergarten children no longer have recess. I mean, this isn't university, kindergarten. 30% don't even have recess. Where is childhood? Where is go outside and play? Sadly, that's being lost. 5 and 6-year-olds are being asked to sit doing math, reading, and writing for hours at a time, sometimes with no recess or a very short one. Some teachers have dispensed with snacks during half-day kindergarten because there just isn't time. Many kindergartners take home homework every day. Notice the title of this article, Sweatshop Kindergarten. It's maddening. It's like slavery. Teacher-led instruction in kindergartens has almost entirely replaced the active, play-based, experiential learning that we know children need from decades of research in cognitive and developmental psychology and neuroscience. So what's interesting is as the world is running on in the direction of a heavy academic focus during kindergarten, opposite to what God has told us to do, science, meanwhile, is actually agreeing with God's counsel. That shouldn't surprise any of us, though, right? Because true science, as we study the workings of the human body, it will always agree with God's counsel. So let's look at some of the counsel. And we've been so influenced, sadly, by this mindset of false education that often we're doing the same thing in our homes. Even with good biblical material, we're using a lot of print books instead of the book of nature. And let's look at some research on that. There is no research to support claims that earlier is better, speaking here of academic learning. A considerable body of evidence clearly indicates the damaging consequences of starting the formal learning of literacy and numeracy too young. The weight of academics, the weight of evidence, the weight of scientific evidence is very much in line with the counsel that we just read, that until the age of 8 or 10, books should not be used. So let's look at some of the damages of what I'm calling here early formal academics. Now there's some different terms we could put on that, but excuse me. I'm speaking here of, our traditional academic focus during the first years of a child's life, or, going contrary to what the Spirit of Prophecy has said, where nature should be the only textbook. And as we read, mothers should not educate from books. So let's look at a little bit of brain development. Who knows what this is? A neuron. Okay, it's what your brain is made out of. It uses for all of its functions. And there are various processes of brain development, but one of the most important is something we call myelination. Myelin is an electrically insulating compound. It coats the axon of the neuron. It speeds the information transfer. It's basically what makes the neuron usable. So when we see a child who is growing and developing, and we see them learn how to talk, and we see them learn how to walk, and you see the dexterity come into the fingers and all these things, that's a lot of that process is myelination as the neurons become usable. If we turn our attention into the brain and the development of the brain, this process occurs in stages and on a pretty set schedule. From conception to 15 months, we see very basic brain development. 15 months into 4.5 years, the limbic system, the relationship areas of the brain are developing. This is, by the way, why it's so important that children are with their parents as much as possible during these early years. That's when the relationship areas of the brain are developing. 4.5 to 7 years, we have what we call gestalt or right hemisphere elaboration. Boys do have a slower growth period during these years, usually about a 2-year difference. And there's reasons for that. We'll talk about some of those later, but don't misunderstand that to mean boys are slow. Boys are not slow, but they do develop differently. And there's, like I said, very good reasons for that. 7 to 9 years is sort of a starting point for the logic areas of the brain, the left hemisphere of the brain in development. That's about 7 years in girls, about 9 years in boys. We see that beginning. And that continues for many years, into the teenage years. And then at around 8 years, we see a significant emphasis on the frontal lobe development. And that continues even into the 30s. Research is now showing us that the frontal lobe continues developing and myelinating into the 30s. And we're just going to pause with these. I just want to focus on these 3 areas, the right hemisphere, left hemisphere, and frontal lobe. The brain has primary processing centers. Let's talk about what the left hemisphere processes. Things like detail. parts and processes of language, linear patterns, logic, critical thinking, numbers, and reasoning skills. While the right hemisphere deals with things such as images, rhythm, emotion, intuition, imagination, creativity, feeling, faith, belief, and large motor control. So, looking at these two hemispheres, which one would be necessary for academic learning as we know it? The left, absolutely. Not that you're not going to use the right, but you really need that left with the detail and the language and the linear patterns, logic, critical thinking, numbers, reasoning, all those things very important for academic learning. I mentioned left hemisphere, right hemisphere, and then we also have the frontal lobe. Within the frontal lobe is what's known as the primary motor cortex, and this is very important for fine motor development, which is vital for handwriting, good handwriting. Inner speech, which is important for internalizing concepts as you're reading. Fine motor eye teaming and foveal focus, I'll talk about that more, but that is, again, very helpful necessary for reading. Now, let's go back to that schedule we just looked at. We saw 4.5 to 7 years was a period of time for the development of the right hemisphere, and the beginning around 7 years in girls, around 9 years in boys, was the left hemisphere. But we saw the left hemisphere and frontal lobe were vital for academic functions, not coming into their major periods of development until around 8 years. But what's a typical school starting age? Are we awake? What's a typical school starting age? 5, okay, that would be average. Some states require it earlier. Some countries around the world are requiring it at age 3. But even if it were age 6, that would be prior to the stage of development in the brain that makes it ready to learn these academic things. So what happens? Now, before continuing, I do want to clarify something. As I've presented this material for quite a while, and I've heard a lot of questions on it, many times we misunderstand this to mean strictly anatomical differences in the brain, where it's the left hemisphere just sits there doing nothing for the first 7 years of life. No. The brain develops as a whole, and it's very integrated. That's actually why we use the words there, gestalt and logic. It is not directly referring to only the left hemisphere and only the right hemisphere. In fact, some of the areas of the left develop before the right and vice versa, so you can't make it too anatomical here. But what is correct to say is that the areas, the gestalt areas, develop before the logic areas of the brain, or as we could put it simply here and just say, the areas of the brain responsible for academic types of learning are not developed until around 8 years of age and even around 10 years of age in boys. This would be the scientifically correct way of putting it. That's just a fact. That's how God designed the brain. You'll have to take it up with Him if you don't like the schedule. But He says don't focus on books at an early age. So we, as modern methodology in the world, we try to do something different. But is it possible to accelerate learning, maybe? Maybe we can just speed it up? Unfortunately not. Damage will be done. Alan Wolf, pediatrician at Children's Hospital, is quoted as saying it's a myth that we can accelerate a child's developmental milestones. Children are kind of pre-programmed to reach those points. I wonder who pre-programmed them. Here's a secular scientist pointing to God and saying, well, somebody made them to reach those points. To understand this, I want to explain how the brain is incredibly plastic, especially at a young age. And so as the brain molds itself to its surroundings, it has the ability to compensate for areas that are not properly or not developed yet, or even in the case, I was talking with a brain surgeon a while ago, and he said, I could take a part out of your brain, and certain parts, not every part, but some parts you can take out of the brain, and other areas will actually begin to compensate for the one that you took out. And it's an incredible ability that God has put into our brain. But he said, that replacement region, it will never be as efficient as the correct one that developed in, integral with the rest of the brain. So here's where we get into trouble. If we have, because of the brain's ability to compensate If we have a child and we're asking them to do an academic task for which the brain is not ready, the brain says, okay, I need to compensate. I need to find some part to do this task, but the correct region hasn't developed yet. And so it looks around and it finds somewhere that has developed yet, and it starts using that. But it's not the correct region. It's not the higher thinking level of the brain that is needed. It's a lower thinking level. So if we're asking a task of the brain for which the corresponding or the correct region is not matured, it begins to form neural routes through lower, more developed sections, and that can result in almost permanent organizational damage. Because it is developing habits early on, we can change later on, but we have laid a foundation in those habits that have developed at an early age. So when we try to force a child to learn something that they're not ready for, it's actually doing damage to the unmyelinated brain, the undeveloped brain. And what we can cause is something called learned helplessness, where the mind is overwhelmed with a task for which it's not ready, and subconsciously the child begins to think, I'm not capable of learning this. They might be perfectly capable, and they may be able to learn it very well later on, but because it was approached too early, they start to think that they're not. So they learn that they're helpless. You've actually taught them that they're incapable of learning a particular thing. It's not that they're actually helpless. And this is a foundational problem in many learning disabilities. I would dare say the majority of learning disabilities that we deal with in education are caused by trying to push it too early and teaching the child that they are incapable of this, and thus you've created a learning disability. Dr. Healy, renowned educational psychologist, she says, plunge daily into the fire of inappropriate expectation. Children's early promise shrivels, and non-learning becomes a habit. We're teaching them not to learn. They may be labeled, treated, exhorted, and eventually tutored, but the basic issue remains unchanged. The school and the child are on different schedules. Perhaps I could use just a simple example to illustrate what we're speaking of here. Let's take math. Most children, you can give them a math problem on paper, 4 plus 5, whatever it is, and they can solve that all day long. But you give them a word problem, and what happens? I don't know how to do this. And you're like, well, you can solve 4 plus 5. It's the concept they're struggling to understand. What we've done there is we've routed, because we did it too early, we've routed the thinking through the lower thinking centers of the brain so that it's processing in the basic 4 plus 5 equals 9 calculations on paper, but you need the higher thinking centers for conceptual understanding of what 4 and 5 actually is. So you can ask a child a practical everyday life problem, if we had 4 of this and 5 of this, can you help me solve this? And they're like, I don't know. But you write it down on paper and they can solve it. And that's because we've routed the thinking through the lower thinking center. And so, my point there is that they can seem like they're doing fine in school, but they're actually not learning properly. So what we need to do here is just be patient. Don't get in a rush. Don't get ahead of God's schedule. We need to learn in practical, hands-on ways rather than with books. And again, can you learn math in the kitchen? Oh my, there's lots of math you can learn in the kitchen or the workshop or, whatever. Many practical ways you can learn math, but and they will learn it much better in those conceptual ways than trying to put it on paper. But the most important thing here is that we need to be focusing on character. That's the principle God has given us here. You don't have enough time to focus on the academics in the early years. You've got to focus on character. But it's not only the brain that is damaged by the early academic setting. The eyes are also damaged. And again, there is some fascinating research that I could share on this. It's all on the DVD series. I don't have time for that in this short presentation. But I mentioned eye teaming earlier. That's the ability to use both of your eyes to focus on a subject, as well as foveal focus, which is two-dimensional focus, both of which are necessary for reading. Those don't develop until approximately the age of 7 to 9. And what Dr. Raymond Moore explains well in his book, School Can Wait, which I have as a resource on the table, excellent resource, I recommend. Even though a single clear visual image may be received by the eye, a child may still not be able to decode or understand printed material because of deficiencies in organization and interpretation in the central nervous system due to lack of maturation. The eyes just haven't matured yet, and they're going to be struggling to read, not because something's wrong with their eyes, but they're just not mature enough for it, and we just need to give them some more time. It's also very linked with myopia, which is nearsightedness, the most common eye problem in the world. The eyeball is not completely shaped with collagen fibers until approximately age 9. So long periods of reading without relaxing the focus into the distance could possibly cause inflammation and elongation of the eyeball, leading to myopia. Now, Dr. Hannaford was on the leading edge of the research when she wrote this. She said possibly cause inflammation. We now know it absolutely does. There's no question about it now. And rates of myopia are soaring. Eye doctors are wondering what's causing this problem. Myopia is an elongated eyeball. We see the normal eye on the left, rounded in shape with a focal point at the back of the eyeball. The myopic eye becomes elongated. Part of the reason for that, when you look into the distance, your eyes are relaxed. They're at rest. But when you look at something up close, the muscles on each side of the lens, called the ciliary bodies, when you look at something up close, those muscles have to contract. And it places a strain on the eyeball. Now, a short period of time, that's okay. That's called an acute spasm. But as you do this for hours every day, as a child would in the classroom, when the eyes are still soft, then it begins stretching these outer layers of the eyeball because it's pulling on their attachment points. And it begins to actually stretch out the eye. And so it's now recognized that one of the leading causes of myopia is simply too much time reading at too early of an age. And it's interesting to compare the rates of myopia around the world. The US is about 50%, and that's pretty bad. But if we compare that to East Asia, we're at 90%. In fact, Seoul, Korea is 96% myopic. Which country spends more time in the classroom? Well, the Asians are pretty famous for spending a lot of time in study. In fact, they have approximately twice the amount of homework that the average child in the US has, and they spend a lot of time indoors. And a lot more fascinating research that we could look at on that. Interesting to compare that to Africa, a continent still predominantly indigenous and spending a lot of time outdoors, far lower rates of myopia. This bit of research was incredible. Indigenous people of the upper Rio Negro region of the Amazon rainforest in northwestern Brazil, they found that myopia was rare among the indigenous population and that age was not associated with the refractive errors in the indigenous people. But what is the... When you go to the eye doctor today, it's just assumed that age will bring about myopia. And they're like, it didn't matter how old they were in these studies of indigenous peoples. And this is just one study out of many. Brazilians from the small city in which the study was performed had higher rates of myopia. Older pre-education adults had a very low prevalence of myopia, whereas the younger, slightly educated Brazilians had a higher prevalence of myopia. So the ones who had gone to school and were living in the city, they had the myopia, whereas the ones who hadn't been reading at an early age, or maybe didn't even know how to read and were living out in the country, they didn't have myopia. And they said the low prevalence of myopia in the illiterate indigenous people is consistent with other studies and suggests that myopia is related to literacy. Now, don't misunderstand this and be like, well, we should all go illiterate so we don't get myopia. No. The way we can prevent this is not starting it too early. Because remember we read that the eyeballs are not shaped and firm until around age 9 or 10. So if we don't do a lot of close-up work and reading in this early age, we wait till later once the eyeball is shaped and more solidified, then we won't have the risk of inflammation as much. It still needs, we still, even as adults, need to be careful how much time we're looking at things up close, but we can definitely prevent it to a great degree by starting later. So close-up work, and another factor is the lack of time outdoors. Don't have time to get into this research right now, but they find that children who spend a lot of time outside have a much lower incidence of myopia. They even find that the light you experience outside blocks that elongation of the eyeball. It prevents the eyeball from getting elongated, which is myopia. So, and it's interesting to compare the light levels. Outdoors, you'll get about 10,000 lux of light, but if you come inside, even in a well-lit room, you're only getting about 500. But they say you actually need about 10,000 for proper eye development in childhood for at least 3 hours a day. So children need to be spending at least 3 hours every single day outside for proper eye health alone. So spend several hours outside each day. Limit the close-up work and reading. Limit and eliminate screen time. Don't have time to get into this, but screens are incredibly damaging to the young eyes. Let's move to point number 3, physical activity. Do we have any teachers here or people who have experience in the classroom? Now, every mother's a teacher, but okay, we have only one. Now, those of you who have been in the traditional classroom can probably answer this question too. What are the 2 most common commands given to children in the classroom? Okay. Shh. Sit down, right? Sit down and be quiet, right? Hold still, be quiet. God says that children need lots of physical activity, though. And we know from brain research, there's something called the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. This is helpful even for adults. It's very healthy for our brains. It's been called miracle grow for the brain. It's very protective for the neurons and actually encourages new neurons to grow. But BDNF is actually known to be required for myelination to proceed. And you say, okay, where do I get BDNF? BDNF is released every time you move a muscle. When you exercise, BDNF is released into the brain, and it's required for myelination to proceed. So in other words, children need to move for their brain to develop. So when we tell them sit still all the time, what are we doing? We're preventing the brain from developing. I think parents need to go to the educators and say, why is my child sitting down for 6 hours a day when he's a 7-year-old boy and he needs to move? Can you imagine the transformation in education if every parent asked that question? But Spirit of Prophecy told it to us. Small children should be left free as lambs to run out of doors, to be free and happy, and should be allowed the most favorable opportunities to lay the foundation for sound constitutions. Now, this has been misunderstood by some, and I want to clarify this. Sometimes we take this to mean, okay, free as lambs to run out of doors. That means they get up in the morning, I open the door, I boot them out, I say, come back at supper time. No. You ever seen any lambs playing out in the pasture? Who's nearby? Mom. Exactly. So when it says free as lambs, it's not saying by themselves. It's saying active, in the outdoors, but mom better be close by. Watching, guiding, teaching. So as much as the day as possible should be active, and definitely play together. I found a bit of research. There's actually a lot of research on playing, which is helpful for children. The world misunderstands that a little bit. But it is interesting to look at that research. And I found an article that gave me a chuckle. It was titled, "Children Should Learn Mainly Through Play Until the Age of 8, says Lego." They would say that, wouldn't they? I mean, that would be in their best interest. But it was interesting because they had some really solid evidence and research in this article. Children should be learning through play. That is an important aspect. But don't leave it at only playing. Be sure to work together also. There's a lot to be learned through the everyday activities of the home. Now, we mentioned making them sit still all the time, but what about telling them to be quiet all the time? Have you ever noticed a group of children playing by themselves? Are they perfectly quiet? Don't hear a sound. No, of course not, right? Lots of chitter-chatter and yelling and talking. What about one child by himself, just a little child playing by himself? Is he perfectly quiet? No, he's still talking. To whom? To himself, right? That's because children don't have something known as inner speech. Inner speech is the ability that we develop as adults to think without having to say it out loud. Some of us still catch ourselves thinking out loud. That's okay. But we have the ability to think inside our minds and process something without having to say it out loud. Children don't have that until around 7, 8, 9, somewhere around there as it begins to develop, this ability of inner speech. So when we tell children to be quiet all the time, we're actually preventing them from thinking and processing. So when we tell them sit still and be quiet day after day, we're telling them we're preventing their brain from developing and we're preventing them from thinking. Don't misunderstand me. It is an important skill for children to learn to sit still and be quiet. We all appreciate that during church. But that shouldn't be all day, every day. That can be learned, during family worship time. It doesn't need to be practiced day in and day out. In fact, it's harmful when it's day in and day out in the classroom. And interestingly, because of this, so insistent is the need for outer speech to hear one's own voice and thoughts that silent reading is ineffective before the age of 7. When we tell a child, when you just sit there and read a book, they're really not getting anything out of it before the age of 7. Interesting how much that lines up with the spirit of prophecy, isn't it? So we need a quiet and simple lifestyle. This helps them learn to not need to be excited and talk all the time, but they also need individual conversation with adults. They need time to be allowed to talk to themselves, and talking together as a family is very important. Conversation, real life conversation, is very, very important for child development. And this leads us to our 5th point of emotional development. This is a vital area we could spend a lot of time on. We understand now that emotion, from brain science, that emotion and cognition are not two separate areas. They are, in fact, very intertwined. Furthermore, emotional development lays a foundation for academic and cognitive development. If a child does not have sufficient emotional development, they will not do well academically. This is why when we have a child with a learning disability, many times, if the researcher is a good one, they're going to look into the home environment of the child also. Because more often than not, we're going to find in a child with a learning disability that there's been some kind of emotional disturbance in the home, a divorce, separation, neglect, abuse, something like that. Emotional development lays the foundation for cognitive development. How do we develop emotional security? It goes back to that principle of true education, relationship. As parents spend time with their children, we're building an emotional security so that the brain begins to feel safe. Emotional security is seen by the brain as a fundamental need of survival. So if they're not getting it, it's going to focus on obtaining that. But if they are feeling emotionally secure, very well connected with their parents, that will allow them to feel free to learn. Emotional well-being and social competence provide a strong foundation for the emerging cognitive abilities, and together they are the bricks and mortar that comprise the foundation of human development. Wow, that's pretty strong, and that comes from Harvard University. So socialize within the home, primarily in the first few years. Develop a solid relationship with your children by spending time together. Time spent cuddling, gazing, and playing establishes a bond of security, trust, and respect on which the entire child development pyramid is based. Point number 6, socialization. I don't have time to get into this right now, but many people are worried about the socialization. Their children need contact with other children. This is just a myth, if I can put it clearly. If we study the research, it's very, very clear. Proper socialization occurs in connection with adults, most specifically with parents. Parents are the best way to socialize a child. Memory skills, many parents get worried about memory skills. Doesn't my child need to learn how to memorize things in school? If we look around the world, the people groups who have the best memories are the ones who didn't go to school. It seems the more time people spend in school, the worse the memories get, because we begin to depend on something else to hold the knowledge for us. Again, all this is on the DVD. I encourage you to watch that. I'm moving very quickly through some of this. I want to cover the point of reading. This is a concern for many parents, and it is undoubtedly quite important. So how can children develop good reading skills? It is interesting that we kind of have this idea as to what age children need to learn to read. But as pointed out here, in many schools, children are identified as behind with reading before they would have even started school in many other countries. So we have this arbitrary age placed on when a child should learn to read, but if you look at other countries, they're like, we're not even teaching them how to read yet. And they learn to read just fine. In fact, the Scandinavian countries, which start reading the latest out of anywhere in the world, have the highest rates of literacy in the world, the ones who start later than everyone else. Now, to understand how to teach a child to read, we need to understand what lays a foundation. What lays a good foundation for reading skills? There are a few things. I'll turn our attention to a renowned and respected journal, the Early Childhood Research Quarterly, number 28. The foundation of later reading, and in particular, reading comprehension, is language. Not flashcards, not word drills, language. So we should ask the question, okay, I want to lay a good foundation for reading. How do I develop good language skills? Any ideas? Talking together. Exactly. Conversation. It's that simple. So simply talking together is the first step to take in creating a good reader. On top of that, you're going to engage in what we call incidental learning throughout the everyday life. When a child asks the question, hey, can you read me this story? Sure, I'll read you the story. But it can be even simpler than that, as they say, what does that sign say, Mom? Or what's the name of this book? Or can you help me learn how to write my name? You know, little things like that that just come up in the everyday life. Take a minute, take 2 minutes, teach a little bit. Great, you've just laid another little foundation block. You don't need to spend a lot of time on that in the early years. You can also use books and reading as a source of gaining needed information about something rather than a forced drill. You know, where we make them do a half hour every day through the Dick and Jane reading series. Whoever invented that series was trying to bore children, I think. You can, when they're interested in something, when they have a question, great, let's get the encyclopedia out, let's figure this out. And they learn to value books as a way that they can gain information about something, but they're not being forced to go through the process of, you know, learning the word drills and things like that. Learning to read is actually quite a bit easier than we think it is. Research indicates it only takes about 30 hours of contact with reading instruction to learn how to read. And other research indicates it's even less than that if we integrate it in the home. Countless parents that I have talked to, I truly have lost count, probably thousands, have told me that, yeah, my child just learned how to read on their own. They just taught themselves. I never gave them any actual instruction in how to read. I talked a lot with them. I would explain a word when they had a question. I would answer the questions. I'd teach them to write little letters and stuff just for the fun of it. And that was that. And when the time came, when the brain was ready, they just began to teach themselves how to read. And I gave them a little help, and pretty soon they were fluent readers. It really can be that simple. And they did a study where they compared 2 groups of children who started learning to read at 2 different ages. They had a group who started learning at age 5, and another group who started learning to read at age 7. And here's a chart comparing their average decoding and reading fluency. They found, so we have at age 5, I'll stand over here, hopefully more of you can see this. At age 5, the first group begins to be taught how to read, represented in the blue. At age 6, there are a few of the second group that are beginning to teach themselves how to read, but at age 7, we have the second group actually beginning their official time of reading instruction. But look how far ahead that group is who started earlier. Now, if we go to age 8, what would we conclude? Well, it must be so much better to start earlier, because look how much more advanced that earlier group is than the ones who started later. Now think about age 8 and what's going on at age 8 and how much comparison we're doing between children at age 8, right? This is the age at which, are they reading yet? How are they doing? We're looking at all the other moms and how they're doing with their programs. And if we make the comparison there, we would assume that it must be better to start earlier. But let's go to the next year, age 9. Look what happened. Those who started earlier, they plateaued. They didn't keep advancing. Why? Because, as we explained at the beginning, the thinking was being routed through a lower thinking center of the brain, not the higher and correct thinking center. So they reached a plateau. They reached a stopping point. It was hard for them to advance beyond that. Meanwhile, those who started later, where we waited for the brain to develop properly, caught up. And then if we look at age 11, look what happened. Those who started later actually passed the ones who started earlier. So there were literally 2 years wasted for the group who started earlier. Furthermore, the children who started at age 5 developed less positive attitudes toward reading. They didn't enjoy it. And they showed poorer text comprehension than those children who had started later. They did another study in a kindergarten. This one is fascinating. It is true that some children can learn to read remarkably early, but the fact that they can does not necessarily mean that they should. Should is another question. One school district set up an experiment to help decide this question. Some kindergartners in the district received extensive instruction in reading. Others spent the same amount of time learning science. They melted ice. They observed thermometers in hot and cold places. They played with magnets, grew plants, learned about animal life, and so on. Books and pictures were available for these children if they wanted them, but no formal lessons in reading were held. What was the result? By 3rd grade, the science children were far ahead of the reading children in their science scores, in their reading scores. The reason? Their vocabularies and thinking skills were more advanced. They could read on more topics and understand higher level materials. The reading children, by starting earlier, used up a lot of time on the skills of reading, while the science children spent the time learning real stuff. And when they did begin reading, they were older and knew more and learned in a fraction of the time that the others took. Wow, what a great study. Fits right along with God's plan too, when he says, don't waste your time on teaching these things at a young age. Focus on character. That's the most important thing. The world says it's the science. Look how much better they did. Yeah, that's great. But imagine if we took that time to focus on character development, how much more important that would be. And I should clarify here, I just thought of it. I talked about learning from the Bible earlier and how the children should be studying the Word of God. And here we're talking about not learning to read at an early age. So, how do we reconcile this? They should be learning the Word of God through you. If we look at the Hebrew culture, the Word of God was taught very diligently to the young children, but it was always orally. It was the parents instructing the children. That's not only beneficial for the parents, but it builds a relationship with the children. They learn it in a way which is natural to their period of development. And then later on, as we are told in the Spirit of Prophecy, the Bible should be the D's and F's given all students. Boys cause 90% of classroom discipline problems. 80% of all high school dropouts are boys. Millions of boys are on Ritalin and other mind-bending control drugs. 3 out of 4 students labeled learning disabled are boys. Now, did God just create boys to be a problem? I asked that question a while ago. There was a brother and sister sitting on the front pew, and the sister was very quick to assure me that, yes, he did create them to be a problem. But of course not, right? What did he create the boys to do? To be the spiritual leaders of their homes and their churches. And we see the decline in male leadership in our churches and in our homes. And we wonder why. And while this is not the only problem, this is a significant problem because year after year they are being compared to the girls and always coming out underneath. We're telling them, maybe not in so many words, but we're telling them that they're dumber than the girls. Or as a friend of mine put one time, we're treating boys like defective girls. God made them different. Why are we comparing them in their academic standing? That's not a very fair comparison. Now, let's be clear. Boys can do excellent at academics, but they just need some more time. Briefly, let me mention ADHD. and many other attention problems. This is very much caused by the early academic environment. In fact, one study found that delaying kindergarten for only 1 year, this is not even waiting till 8 to 10, just a 1-year delay of kindergarten, reduced inattention and hyperactivity by 73%. Do you realize what a big difference that is in a scientific study? We're not talking a 1 or 2% margin, 73% for an average child at 11, and it virtually eliminated the probability that an average child at that age would have an abnormal or higher than normal rating for the inattentive hyperactive behavior measure. Let's get rid of ADHD by simply waiting a bit and not creating it. I should mention dyslexia here. Dyslexia is extremely complex and not well understood by science, but we do have enough research as well as anecdotal evidence to indicate that dyslexia is definitely exacerbated by early reading. It may not be actually caused by it because there are a lot of genetic factors, but it is definitely exacerbated by early reading, and it can be helped by more outdoor time, more physical exercise, practical work with a heavy emphasis on conversation with the parents. Many times this will significantly help with dyslexia, if not prevent it completely, even if there is a genetic factor. Won't children be left behind? Well, you'll have to watch the DVD series to understand how much better they will do by simply waiting a few years. Certainly they are not left behind. But let's get to our final and most important point, and that is spiritual strength. This is what matters, right? True education is about redemption. The early years, we know from science, are an important time for the development of spirituality, cause to effect reasoning, emotion, relationships, behavior management, language, memory, moral understanding, conscience, character. Is this an important list? Does anyone want their child deficient in any of these things? Of course not. So why do I put the list up here? Every one of the functions, these functions in the brain, develops in the first 7 years of a child's life. And I imagine, well, I don't imagine, I know Satan knows this too, doesn't he? And I imagine he thinks to himself, character development occurs best in the early years of life. I don't want that to happen, so what am I going to do? And he has masterfully created a system of false education which has brainwashed us into thinking we must focus on the academic training at an early age, getting us to believe that that's the most important thing because he knows we can focus on that early on and it will distract us from focusing on character development in the early years. He knows we can learn the academics later on, but he doesn't care about the later on. He cares about right now during the early years. And so he's trying to get us to pass this vital window of character development. The early years are a critical period for the development of the areas of the brain that lay the foundation for spiritual strength. Pressure in academics will suppress spiritual development also. That is research-based. And I read a part of this earlier. I'll read it in its entirety right here. Parents, especially mothers, should be the only teachers of such infant minds. Now you say infants. Yeah, I know that much. What is infants? Just prior to this, the paragraph before this, she identifies what infancy is, what age infancy is. She says it extends through age 7. So when does infancy end? What age? Age 8. No, it extends through 7. So it ends at age 8. And then she says they should not educate from books. The children generally will be inquisitive to learn the things of nature. They will ask questions in regard to the things they see and hear. Did God know a little something about children? They will ask questions in regard to the things they see and hear. I mean, that's just an identifying mark of a toddler, right? And parents should improve the opportunity to instruct and patiently answer these little inquiries. They can in this manner. How? By taking the questions, taking the advantage of that, and instructing. In this manner, they can get the advantage of the enemy. Who wants to get the advantage of the enemy? And fortify the minds of their children by sowing good seed in their hearts, leaving no room for the bad to take root. The mother's loving instruction at a tender age is what is needed by children in the formation of character. Now, this is a principle in the Bible also. This doesn't only come from the spirit of prophecy. To everything there is a season, we're told. And a time to every purpose under heaven. God has a schedule. First the blade, Jesus said, then the ear. After that, the full corn in the ear. And we're given an explanation on this. The gradual development of the plant from the seed is an object lesson in child training. He who gave this parable created the tiny seed, gave it its vital properties, and ordained the laws that govern its growth. The little one should be educated in childlike simplicity. Childhood answers to the blade in the parable. So in that parable Jesus gave, first the blade, then the ear, then the full corn in the ear, that blade is representative of childhood. Children should not be forced into a precocious maturity, but as long as possible should retain the freshness and grace of their early years. Who's grown some corn? Anyone? All right, quite a few of you. So imagine you planted some corn in your garden, and you went out 10 days later, something like that, and you look out in the garden, and you see some little corn plants coming up. What do? I wanted corn. I don't have any corn. Why don't I have corn? No, you don't do that, right? You say, I have corn. Now, if somebody's looking at you, they'll be like, what are you talking about? You don't have corn, you have a plant. No, you have the promise of corn, right? You know what it can become. And you're excited about that little plant because you see the potential. There is a beauty, peculiarly its own. Peculiar to that blade. There's a beauty there. Don't try to rush it along. If you went and you took that corn plant and said, okay, I recognize the potential here, but I need corn sooner than is the rate it's going, and so you took the plant and you started pulling on it to try to make it go faster, would that work? No, of course not. You'd kill it. You'd ruin its growth and development. God has a schedule. Let's just trust it. Don't focus on the books. Spend time in nature. Spend time in the garden. Spend time on walks, outdoor tasks, chores. Focus on character. Putting your child on God's schedule. The point I want to just wrap this up with is understanding that we spend a lot of time on the science about what not to do, and that's important. I think we all need that to help cement our faith in this and understand, it isn't the academics we should be focusing on. But don't get stuck with that, parents, okay? Don't stop with, don't do books. Move on to what you should do also. The greater focus in the spirit of prophecy is on what we should be doing, more than what we shouldn't be doing. And really what the point is that the spirit of prophecy is making is that to develop a character for eternity, it requires so much time. It requires so much focus during the early years that you don't have time for books and academics. And so the Lord has told us, don't worry about the books, and He's assured us now through the science that can come later. You don't need to worry about it. They'll learn it better later on. But what they won't learn better later on is character development and relationship with you. Focus on that now and leave the other things for later. Spend time with your children. Study the book of nature. Leave the rest in God's hands. Let's close with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we are again grateful for what a beautiful outline you've given us, how you've just not spared any details in explaining to us your plan, your schedule, the principles of development. Help us to follow, forgive us for where we have distrusted your methods, and help us to obey you. We ask for your continued presence, and we ask in Jesus' name.